Hello everyone. In this presentation we're going to see how to build secure applications in GeneXus 18. With GAM, which stands for GeneXus Access Manager, you can set up an identity provider in your application. What does an identity provider mean? It is an application where you're going to centralize all the different users of an organization. This will centralize both users and passwords. And what an identity provider does is that client applications can be connected to it using the OAuth protocol, the OAuth 2.0 protocol. It's important to know that clients don't need to have applications developed with GeneXus. Single sign-on is another feature that allows you to, that identity providers allow you. They authenticate in the first access to an application, which means that when they're going to have access to a second application, users will not be requested their credentials to have access to it. This is also worked out when you configure an identity provider with GAM. IDP of IDP is when you implement an identity provider and this IDP authenticates using another external IDP that could be Azure, Google, Facebook, etc. Regarding the types of authentication, this means how you can authenticate the application that you are developing in GeneXus with the different options that you have in the market for authentication. So in this case, I want to share with you three different authentication types. You have one-time password, one-time password, and two-factor authentications. OTPs are very requested by those users that don't want to have passwords to have access to their applications. It's a single time password and it's good for a short period of time. GAM predetermined will send by email that information, but you can implement that code to be sent by SMS or by a notification. One-time password is similar to the one before, but the algorithm created by the code is based on time. This means that the user needs to install an application in their device that is called Authenticator. You have Google's Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. So you've got plenty in the market. You will install that in your device and you will register the application that you developed in that Authenticator. So the application is going to give you a password to have access to it. All of this that I'm telling you about is without having to write a single line of code. You just set up a type of authentication in GAM. Another feature that we have implemented is 2FA, two-factor authentication, which is the same as multi-factor authentication. This means that you will validate two different values to have access to the application. For example, you could use as a first case a user and password, and if that is successful, then you will move on to a second factor authentication, which could be OTP or TOTP. In this kind of authentication, what we did for version 18 is we did the same for mobile and web generators, and I'll be showing you a little bit in a couple of minutes how to implement these authentications in mobile. This is the example to implement a one-time password for native mobile. What you see in the top left part of the screen is the panel that has two charts. You have the top chart and the bottom chart. When you start running this panel, it will only deploy the upper chart so that the user can enter their name and click on next. And for that, you will see on the right in the code the first event that I'm showing you, which is next event, which is the login event. It's going to validate that that user exists in that database. If this is successful, then you're moving on to the next point, which is an event is going to be triggered. We built events so that you can take control of that second authentication step. So you will have events that will be called GAM login event.otp authentication requested. And in this case, what you have is you've programmed to hide the table above and you will only deploy the table below. What does that mean? That users will have access, will be accessing only with the code that they got by email. But perfectly, in this event, you might as well just program it so that it will be redirected to another panel and the code will be entered from that other panel. So in the case of two-factor authentications, that is very similar to the previous case. You have a login panel where when you log in, you will only deploy the top part of the chart. As you can see, you enter the username and the password. And when you click on next, which is the first event that I'm showing you in the code part on the right, you will see that it will validate user and password. And to move on to the second factor, you need to have that first successful stage completed. When that is successful, then it will trigger the event that appears in the bottom part of the screen that is called GAM login event.two-factor authentication requested. For this kind of authentication, this two-factor authentications, you may set it up so that it's mandatory for all users in the application, or you can just leave it optional so that users will choose whether they want to use this two-step authentication process or not. Another kind of authentication that you can use in your applications developed with GeneXus is, for example, authenticating with external providers that use different protocols. We support authentication with OAuth 2.0, OpenID Connect, or SAML 2.0. In the case of OAuth 2.0, what we have done is we have completed all the flow that we didn't have before, which means that to authenticate with this identity provider, it will not redirect you to this one, but you will just enter the username and password without having to be redirected. OpenID Connect is another authentication protocol that runs on OAuth 2.0, but it uses a public certification that allows you to know the identity of the end user. SAML 2.0, well, this year we had a number of success stories, especially with Azure and Okta, and everyone that has used this kind of authentication has helped us to improve our documentation, which is very updated. And in the bottom part of the slides, you will have the link to each part of authentication with GAM that we are seeing in this presentation. So now let's talk about how to set up OAuth 2.0 without having to be redirected to the identity provider. So what we will do first is we will go to the authentication type that we have configured. This is the backend screen, and you go to that checkbox that is, in red, and you need to unclick that. You need to uncheck that box. Then you will go to token above, and you will see this property that is called grant type, and value for that needs to be password. Yeah. So just by touching those two properties, you will have the new authentication flow, OAuth 2.0. In terms of the kinds of authentication for Angular, we've been working and we will keep on working so that we have all the availables given by GAM. So far, what we had was with Angular, local authentication and custom authentication. And for this version, we are releasing remote GAM authentication, remote REST GAM authentication, and you can also authenticate with all the different identity providers. That means OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. Integrated security by domain is this new feature that we are using to identify whether or not we have an authenticated user for the different applications in a certain domain. When you're using an application, you can use that solution that I told you about today, which is a single sign-on that has each application connected to an identity provider. It redirects you, and the identity provider will tell you whether or not that user is authenticated. What's different with that is that that will support applications to be in different servers or in different domains, and it works well. This feature works only with applications that are in one single domain, so you have to configure in GAM what domain you want the information to be registered. You have a secret for the JWT and an AES encryption key, and it will register information that the application will later on be able to read. Yeah, the application that you want to notify. So how do you read that? You're going to use the method that you see on the screen that is called valid integrated security by domain. That if it returns a user ID, it's because you have an authenticated user, and in that case, you can have access to their information. We have also worked in redesigning our GAM backend, the backend that we have compiled. Now this is based on Unanimo, which means that there are many usability improvements. Another very important feature is that now the backend, now that it's compiled, you can customize the style, the colors, fonts, size, etc. And to do this, you need to have a design system that is Unanimo based, and you need to configure a property that is called GAM backend style override that will configure your design system, and you will get the backend's look and feel to look the same as your application. So now we changed something that when you go to the backend, you will have access to a dashboard that has a summary of user statistics for security managers. So for example, it can check between two dates how many users registered, how many sessions were open, in what applications those sessions were open, because this backend will be managing all the applications for that platform. And it also gives you a timeline so that you can analyze how many sessions, for example, were open every single day, depending on that timeline. So you can filter that in the top part of the dashboard. In the bottom part of the dashboard, you will have two values that are absolute values for the platform. That is the number of users registered and the number of sessions that are active. We keep improving the quality of the code that we are generating with GeneXus, and we are including tools for static analysis of the generated code. This is helping us to improve both quality and security in that code. For this case, we are integrating in the development process different Veracode tools to begin with, but we will keep on adding new tools. Okay, thank you so much, and try GeneXus 18.